There are stories that frighten people because they involve monsters, ghosts, or unexplained supernatural forces. Then there are stories that are far more disturbing because every major event actually happened. The story of Christopher Knight belongs to the second category. It is not a tale about a haunted forest or an ancient curse. Instead, it is the extraordinary account of an ordinary man who vanished from society without leaving behind a single clue, only to spend the next 27 years living alone in one of the harshest forests in the northeastern United States. During that time, he became an invisible presence, surviving in complete isolation while secretly entering more than 1,000 vacation cabins for food and supplies. The people living around him never knew he was there, yet for decades he quietly watched the rhythms of their lives from the shadows of the trees. It is one of the strangest and most unsettling true stories ever documented. On an ordinary autumn afternoon in 1986, 20-year-old Christopher Knight climbed into his black Subaru and drove away from his family's home in Massachusetts. Nothing about that morning seemed unusual. There was no argument with his parents, no dramatic farewell, and no indication that he intended to disappear forever. He simply got into his car and left. His family believed he was starting a new chapter in life, perhaps looking for work or hoping to build a future somewhere else. They expected a phone call within a few days. When the phone never rang, they assumed he was busy settling into a new routine. Days passed without any contact. Those days slowly turned into weeks, and the weeks became months. Eventually, everyone reached the same painful conclusion. Christopher Knight had disappeared. No ransom demands were ever made. No abandoned vehicle was discovered. Police had almost nothing to investigate because he had not committed a crime, and there were no signs that anyone had forced him to leave. It seemed as though he had simply walked out of one life and vanished into thin air. The truth, however, was far stranger than anything his family could have imagined. Instead of moving to another city or beginning a new career, Christopher had driven nearly 300 miles north into the wilderness of central Maine. After reaching an isolated logging road near North Pond, he parked his car, locked the doors, and stepped into the forest carrying only a few basic belongings. That was the last time he would use a vehicle, sleep inside a house, or live according to the routines of ordinary society. From that moment onward, the forest would become his entire world. He never returned to retrieve his car, and he never attempted to reconnect with the people he had left behind. It was a decision that would define the next 27 years of his life. The forests surrounding North Pond are vast, rugged, and unforgiving. Towering pine trees stretch across thousands of acres, creating a landscape where sunlight barely reaches the ground in many places. During the winter months, temperatures often plunge well below freezing, while heavy snow buries trails and roads beneath several feet of ice and packed snow. Even experienced hunters, hikers, and forestry workers occasionally lose their way in these woods. Rescue teams have spent days searching for missing people, sometimes without success. It is a place where nature holds every advantage and human beings are reminded just how fragile they really are. Most people would struggle to survive there for a single week without proper equipment. Christopher Knight would remain hidden within that wilderness for nearly 3 decades. The first winter arrived quickly. Bitter winds swept through the forest as temperatures continued to fall. The lakes froze solid, and snow covered nearly every visible landmark. Anyone else would have viewed these conditions as impossible, but Christopher accepted them as the price of disappearing. Deep beneath a canopy of evergreen trees, he carefully constructed a tiny campsite designed not for comfort but for invisibility. Using tarps, ropes, and natural vegetation, he created a shelter that blended almost perfectly into the surrounding forest. Even if someone walked only a short distance away, there was a good chance they would never notice it. Every decision he made revolved around one goal: remaining unseen. He avoided lighting fires during the day because smoke could be spotted from a distance. He limited unnecessary movement, especially in open areas where someone might notice footprints or disturbed vegetation. Every action reflected patience, discipline, and an extraordinary awareness of his surroundings. As the months passed, Christopher began learning the forest in ways that few people ever could. He memorized the positions of rock formations, streams, and fallen trees. He understood how sounds traveled through the woods during different seasons. He recognized the calls of birds and learned which noises signaled the approach of hikers or hunters. Over time, the wilderness stopped feeling like an unfamiliar place and became an extension of himself. Every trail, every ridge, and every hidden clearing formed part of an invisible map stored entirely in his memory. While other people visited the forest for recreation, Christopher transformed it into a permanent home. Only a short distance from his hidden camp stood dozens of vacation cabins scattered around North Pond. During the summer months, these cabins were filled with families enjoying fishing trips, holidays, and quiet weekends away from the city. Children played near the shoreline, couples gathered around evening campfires, and boats drifted peacefully across the lake. When autumn ended, however, most of those families packed their belongings and returned home, leaving the cabins empty until the following spring. Curtains remained closed, furniture stayed exactly where it had been left, and the entire area settled into months of silence. To anyone driving through the region during winter, it appeared completely deserted. But it wasn't. Hidden among the trees, Christopher Knight quietly observed the seasonal rhythms of the community. From concealed positions deep within the forest, he watched people arrive and depart. He learned which cabins remained empty throughout the winter and which owners occasionally returned for short visits. He noticed which families always arrived on Friday evenings and which left early Sunday mornings. He listened to the sound of vehicles traveling along distant roads and could often identify what kind of vehicle was approaching long before it came into view. Over months and eventually years, this careful observation allowed him to predict people's routines with remarkable accuracy. He wasn't spying out of malice or preparing to harm anyone. He was gathering the information he needed to survive without being discovered. Eventually, small and seemingly insignificant things began disappearing from the cabins. A loaf of bread vanished from one kitchen. A flashlight could no longer be found inside another cabin. Someone noticed that several cans of soup were missing from a pantry. Another family realized a spare blanket had disappeared from a closet. At first, these incidents appeared too minor to attract much attention. Many owners assumed they had simply forgotten where they had left certain items or blamed visiting relatives for using supplies during previous trips. Some even suspected curious raccoons or other wildlife. None of them imagined that another human being had quietly entered their homes while they were away. As the disappearances continued year after year, the explanations became harder to believe. Different families reported similar experiences. Food was missing. Batteries had vanished. Propane tanks occasionally disappeared without explanation. Yet nothing expensive had been taken. Jewelry remained untouched. Cash stayed inside drawers. Televisions, cameras, and valuable equipment were left exactly where owners had placed them. Whoever was entering these cabins appeared interested only in the basic necessities required to stay alive. It was an unusual pattern that puzzled both homeowners and local law enforcement. More disturbing than the missing supplies was the realization that someone had managed to enter locked cabins without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. Doors remained closed. Windows were intact. The intruders seemed to appear and disappear without leaving behind any evidence at all. Before long, rumors spread throughout the North Pond community. Conversations around campfires and local stores increasingly revolved around the mysterious cabin burglar. Some residents believed several thieves were working together, while others suspected experienced hunters or drifters passing through the area. A few whispered stranger theories, wondering whether the forest itself concealed secrets no one fully understood. Whatever the explanation, one unsettling fact became impossible to ignore. Someone was living out there among the trees. Someone who understood the wilderness so completely that year after year, despite growing concern and repeated investigations, no one could find even the slightest trace of their existence. Little did they know that, hidden beneath layers of pine branches less than a mile away, Christopher Knight was listening to those conversations from the darkness, remaining exactly what he had set out to become nearly 3 decades earlier: a ghost in the woods. As the years passed, Christopher Knight settled into a routine that almost no one could have imagined possible. While the rest of the world measured time by calendars, careers, holidays, and birthdays, his life revolved around the changing seasons. Spring meant melting snow and swollen streams. Summer brought longer days and the arrival of vacationers. Autumn signaled the return of silence as families packed up their cabins and headed home. Winter, with its bitter cold and endless nights, became the greatest test of his endurance. Every season presented new challenges, but Christopher adapted to them with remarkable patience. He no longer viewed the forest as a place to survive. It had become the only home he knew. Living unseen required far more than building a hidden shelter. Every movement had to be carefully planned. Christopher understood that the smallest mistake could expose him. A snapped branch, a discarded food wrapper, fresh footprints in the snow, or smoke rising above the trees could reveal his location to hunters, hikers, or game wardens. He learned to travel mostly after dark, moving quietly beneath the dense canopy where moonlight rarely reached the forest floor. He often stepped onto rocks instead of soft ground to avoid leaving tracks and chose routes that crossed streams whenever possible, allowing the flowing water to erase any evidence of his passage. These habits were not developed overnight. They were perfected through years of observation, trial, and extraordinary self-discipline. His senses gradually became sharper than those of most people. Christopher learned to identify vehicles simply by the sound of their engines echoing through the forest. He could distinguish between a pickup truck, a snowmobile, and a fishing boat without ever seeing them. The calls of birds became an early warning system. If a flock of crows suddenly erupted into loud cries, it often meant someone was approaching. The distant barking of a dog usually signaled the arrival of hikers or hunters. Even changes in the wind carried valuable information. What seemed like meaningless background noise to ordinary visitors became essential knowledge for a man determined to remain invisible. Only a short distance from his hidden campsite, life continued almost exactly as it always had. During the summer, families returned to their cabins around North Pond to enjoy peaceful weekends on the lake. Children laughed while swimming from wooden docks, couples gathered around campfires late into the evening, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings as they passed one another in small boats. To everyone enjoying those quiet vacations, the surrounding forest appeared peaceful and empty. None of them realized that another human being was silently observing those same scenes from deep within the trees. Christopher rarely came close enough to be noticed. Instead, he watched from concealed locations, patiently studying the routines of the people around him. He learned who visited only during holidays, who stayed for entire summers, and which cabins remained abandoned for months at a time. These observations were never driven by violence or curiosity alone. They were essential to his survival. Knowing when a cabin would be empty allowed him to enter without risking an encounter. Eventually, the mysterious disappearances became impossible to ignore. What had once seemed like isolated incidents now affected nearly every cabin owner in the area. One family discovered that several cans of soup and vegetables had disappeared from their pantry. Another found their flashlight and spare batteries missing. A propane tank vanished from a storage shed without any sign of forced entry. Sleeping bags, warm blankets, fishing equipment, and simple tools occasionally disappeared as well. Strangely, expensive items remained untouched. Cash was left inside drawers, jewelry stayed exactly where it had been placed, and valuable electronics were ignored. The burglars seemed interested only in the basic supplies needed to survive another week in the wilderness. This unusual pattern confused both homeowners and investigators. Most burglars stole whatever could be sold quickly for money. Christopher Knight never did. His choices reflected necessity rather than greed. Peanut butter, canned meat, instant noodles, crackers, batteries, propane cylinders, books, and warm clothing were far more valuable to him than expensive watches or television sets. Every item he carried back into the forest served a practical purpose. Books became companions during long winters of complete solitude. Batteries-powered flashlights and small radios that connected him, however briefly, to the outside world. Propane allowed him to cook without creating the smoke that an open fire would produce. Everything he stole was chosen with survival in mind. The greatest source of fear, however, was not what disappeared. It was what remained behind. Homeowners often returned to find their cabins looking perfectly normal. Doors were still locked. Windows remained closed. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left months earlier. Nothing appeared disturbed. Only after carefully checking cupboards and closets did they notice small but unsettling differences. A flashlight was gone. A sleeping bag had vanished. A few cans of food were missing from the shelf. The realization slowly settled into their minds. Someone had entered their homes while they were away, walked through every room, selected exactly what they needed, and left without leaving behind any obvious trace. The thought was deeply unsettling. If someone could enter so quietly, how many times had they done it before without anyone realizing? Rumors spread rapidly throughout the small North Pond community. At first, neighbors joked about a mysterious cabin thief who preferred peanut butter to jewelry. As the years passed, those jokes faded into genuine concern. Parents warned their children not to wander too far into the woods alone. Visitors became increasingly cautious whenever they locked their cabins at the end of the season. Local residents exchanged stories about strange disappearances, comparing notes in an attempt to understand who or what was responsible. Some believed several people must have been working together because it seemed impossible for a single individual to avoid capture for so many years. Others suspected experienced survivalists or transient hunters living deep within the forest. A few even whispered supernatural explanations, unable to imagine any ordinary person possessing such remarkable ability to remain unseen. Law enforcement faced an increasingly frustrating challenge. Every report described the same pattern. Basic supplies disappeared, yet there were almost never any signs of forced entry. Patrols through the surrounding forests produced nothing. Search teams found no hidden shelters, no abandoned campsites, and no evidence of anyone living in the wilderness. Experienced game wardens walked miles of logging roads and hunting trails, convinced they would eventually uncover the thief's hideout. Instead, every search ended in failure. It seemed as though the mysterious intruders simply dissolved into the forest after every burglary. Meanwhile, Christopher Knight continued refining his routines with extraordinary precision. He rarely entered cabins during daylight and almost never approached occupied homes. If a family remained longer than expected, he simply waited. Patience became his greatest advantage. Sometimes he observed a cabin for hours before deciding it was safe to move. On other occasions, he waited several days for the right opportunity. He understood that rushing even once could destroy everything he had built over the previous years. His greatest weapon was not speed or strength. It was his willingness to remain perfectly still until the moment was right. By the mid-1990s, Christopher's knowledge of the area had become astonishingly detailed. He no longer relied on guesswork when choosing which cabins to enter. Years of careful observation allowed him to predict people's schedules with remarkable accuracy. He knew which families arrived every Memorial Day weekend, which owners always closed their cabins by October, and which roads became deserted after the first heavy snowfall. He wasn't following a written map or recording notes. Everything existed only in his memory. It was as though he carried an invisible blueprint of the entire region inside his mind, updated continuously through observation and experience. As the burglaries continued year after year, local newspapers occasionally mentioned the mysterious thefts, adding to the growing legend of the unknown hermit hiding somewhere within the forests of central Maine. The story fascinated outsiders but frustrated the people living near North Pond. They wanted answers, not legends. Yet every passing year only deepened the mystery. Children who had once heard stories about the invisible cabin burglar grew into adults, inherited the same family cabins, and discovered that the disappearances were still happening. The mysterious figures seemed almost timeless, an unseen presence that quietly slipped between the trees while the rest of the world moved on. Hidden beneath layers of evergreen branches, Christopher Knight remained exactly where no one thought to look. Every successful burglary strengthened his confidence. Every failed search reinforced his belief that he could remain invisible forever. But history has a way of exposing even the most carefully guarded secrets. After nearly 2 decades of perfect concealment, the Invisible Man of North Pond was about to become more than a local mystery. He was about to become one of the most extraordinary legends in modern American history. By the late 1990s, the mysterious burglar had become more than just an unsolved case. He had become a legend. Throughout the communities surrounding North Pond, stories about the invisible intruder spread from one family to another until almost everyone had heard them. New cabin owners were warned about him shortly after purchasing their property. Children grew up listening to stories about a man who could slip into locked cabins without breaking windows or forcing doors. Visitors often dismissed the tales as local folklore, convinced that years of exaggerated storytelling had transformed a few ordinary burglaries into something mythical. That confidence usually lasted only until they experienced the mystery themselves. A missing flashlight, an empty pantry shelf, or a vanished propane cylinder was often enough to convince even the greatest skeptics that someone was quietly living among the forests, watching from places no one else could see. Christopher Knight, meanwhile, had become almost inseparable from the wilderness itself. More than a decade of complete isolation had changed the way he experienced the world. Civilization had faded into a distant memory, replaced by a life governed entirely by nature. He woke with the sunrise, slept shortly after darkness settled over the forest, and measured time not by clocks but by changing temperatures, migrating birds, and the arrival of snowfall. The sounds of engines, conversations, and televisions that most people encountered every day had become rare interruptions in an otherwise silent existence. Solitude was no longer something he endured. It had become his natural state. Remaining hidden for so many years demanded extraordinary discipline. Christopher never allowed himself to grow careless simply because he had escaped detection. If anything, he became even more cautious with every passing season. He avoided leaving behind anything that could identify him. Food packaging was carefully disposed of or burned without producing noticeable smoke. Paths leading toward his campsite were never allowed to become visible trails. He rarely walked the same route twice in succession, understanding that repeated patterns could eventually reveal his location. During winter, when fresh snow preserved every footprint, he often delayed traveling until conditions changed or snowfall erased the evidence. He recognized that nature itself could either protect him or expose him depending on how carefully he moved through it. His hidden camp reflected the same level of precision. Unlike the chaotic shelters often associated with people living in the wilderness, Christopher's campsite was remarkably organized. Supplies were arranged neatly beneath tarps designed to keep them dry throughout Maine's harsh winters. Books were carefully protected from moisture and stacked methodically. Clothing was folded and stored wherever possible. Cooking equipment remained hidden beneath layers of camouflage. The entire camp occupied surprisingly little space, blending almost perfectly into the surrounding forest. Searchers later admitted that they had unknowingly passed close to the area on several occasions without ever recognizing that someone was living there. It was not luck that protected Christopher. It was an extraordinary understanding of concealment developed over thousands of days and nights in complete isolation. While Christopher's confidence continued growing, so did the frustration of cabin owners. The mysterious burglaries showed no signs of ending. Each year brought fresh reports of missing food, batteries, clothing, and camping supplies. Families returned to cabins expecting peaceful weekends only to discover that someone had quietly visited during their absence. The burglar remained strangely selective. Expensive cameras, jewelry, and cash continued to be ignored. Instead, the intruder consistently chose practical items that would help someone survive another season in the woods. Investigators found this pattern deeply puzzling. Most criminals sought financial gain. This individual appeared interested only in staying alive. The unsettling nature of the burglaries gradually changed how people viewed their own homes. Locked doors no longer offered complete reassurance. Every unfamiliar sound outside after sunset attracted attention. Some cabin owners began wondering whether they had unknowingly crossed paths with the mysterious hermit while walking nearby trails. Others questioned whether someone had been watching their families from the surrounding woods during vacations. Although there was no evidence that Christopher had ever intended to harm anyone, the possibility that an unseen stranger had silently observed them for years created a deep sense of unease. Fear often grows strongest not from what is known, but from what remains hidden. As concern increased, homeowners invested in better security. Stronger locks appeared on cabin doors. Motion-sensitive lights illuminated entrances that had once remained dark. Some families placed small objects behind doors before leaving, hoping they would be disturbed if someone entered. Others photographed shelves and cupboards so they could compare them upon returning months later. A few even experimented with homemade alarms, believing they might finally catch the elusive burglar. None of these efforts produced meaningful results. Christopher adapted to every new precaution with remarkable patience. If one cabin appeared risky, he simply waited for another opportunity elsewhere. His greatest advantage was that he never operated according to anyone else's timetable. Law enforcement also intensified its efforts. Local deputies, state police, and game wardens reviewed burglary reports spanning many years, hoping to identify patterns that earlier investigators had overlooked. Patrols increased during hunting season when more people were already traveling through the woods. Search teams combed abandoned logging roads, remote campsites, and dense forests where they believed the burglar might be hiding. Every search ended the same way. They found abandoned fire pits left by campers, forgotten hunting blinds, and old logging equipment slowly disappearing beneath moss and trees. They never found Christopher Knight. With every unsuccessful investigation, the legend surrounding the North Pond Hermit grew even stronger. Among those determined to solve the mystery was a Maine game warden named Terry Hughes. Unlike many others who believed the burglar simply benefited from extraordinary luck, Hughes suspected something different. He believed the mysterious intruder possessed exceptional patience and discipline. That realization changed his entire approach. Instead of wandering aimlessly through miles of forest hoping to discover a hidden camp, Hughes began carefully studying the burglaries themselves. He collected reports dating back years and placed them onto detailed maps. He compared seasons, weather conditions, cabin locations, and the types of supplies stolen during each break-in. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The burglar consistently targeted cabins stocked with food and basic necessities. The thefts were not random. They reflected the needs of someone living permanently in the wilderness. Meanwhile, Christopher remained completely unaware that anyone had begun analyzing his behavior so carefully. His routine continued almost unchanged. During daylight hours, he remained hidden within the forest, reading books, maintaining equipment, and conserving energy. After darkness settled over North Pond, he occasionally left his camp to gather whatever supplies he needed. Every movement reflected years of practice. He knew exactly which trails remained empty after sunset, which cabins were abandoned for the season, and how to move without attracting attention. Decades of success had strengthened his belief that invisibility was permanent. It seemed impossible that anyone could still discover him after so many years. By now, Christopher had spent nearly 2 decades without meaningful conversation. The silence surrounding him was unlike anything most people could imagine. Days passed without hearing another human voice. Weeks blended together with almost no social interaction whatsoever. The radio occasionally reminded him that civilization still existed beyond the forest, but those distant voices belonged to another world. Psychologists would later describe his level of voluntary isolation as almost unprecedented in modern history. Most people experience severe emotional distress after prolonged solitude. Christopher somehow adapted to conditions that many experts considered nearly unbearable. Yet even after years of studying his case, few could fully explain how he managed to preserve his mental stability while living almost entirely alone. As another winter settled across central Maine, heavy snow once again covered the forests surrounding North Pond. Cabin owners locked their doors and returned to cities, believing they were leaving behind empty buildings waiting quietly for spring. Hidden beneath layers of evergreen branches, Christopher Knight prepared for another season of complete solitude. Like every winter before it, he believed he had mastered the art of remaining invisible. He had no way of knowing that someone else had finally begun mastering the art of finding him. After 27 years of perfect concealment, the greatest manhunt in the history of North Pond was quietly entering its final chapter. By the beginning of 2013, the mystery of the North Pond Hermit had lasted for nearly 27 years. What had once been dismissed as a handful of unexplained burglaries had evolved into one of the longest-running unsolved investigations in the history of rural Maine. Cabin owners had come and gone. Children who had once listened to stories about the invisible burglar had grown into adults, and countless investigators had searched the surrounding forests without success. The man living among the trees had become almost mythical. Some people believed he possessed extraordinary survival skills. Others wondered whether several individuals were working together. A few even questioned whether the stories had become exaggerated over time. Yet every new burglary reminded everyone that the mysterious intruder was still out there, moving silently through the wilderness while remaining completely invisible. Among those who refused to give up was Maine Game Warden Terry Hughes. Unlike earlier investigators who concentrated on searching the forest, Hughes focused on understanding the burglar himself. He believed that Christopher Knight, although exceptionally disciplined, was still human. Human beings develop routines, and routines create patterns. If those patterns could be understood, eventually they could be interrupted. Hughes carefully studied years of burglary reports, comparing the locations of cabins, the seasons in which thefts occurred, and the types of supplies that consistently disappeared. The evidence pointed toward one simple conclusion. The burglar was not stealing for profit. He was stealing to survive. That meant his need for food would eventually force him to take another risk. Rather than organizing another massive search through thousands of acres of forest, Hughes developed a quieter plan. Working with local cabin owners, he selected a storage building that contained food and supplies likely to attract the mysterious burglar. Instead of relying on visible security cameras or noisy alarm systems, they installed a hidden motion detector connected to a silent notification system. If someone entered the building, no sirens would sound. No flashing lights would appear. Only Hughes would receive the alert. It was a simple idea built upon years of careful observation. Instead of chasing the burglar through the wilderness, Hughes intended to let the burglar come to him. For days, nothing happened. The storage building remained untouched while winter slowly released its grip on the forests of central Maine. Then, during the evening of April 4, 2013, the alarm finally activated. Hughes immediately realized that this might be the opportunity he had waited years to see. He drove quietly toward the property without using emergency lights or sirens. Every movement had to remain calm because he knew the man he was hunting had spent nearly 3 decades avoiding detection. One careless mistake could allow him to disappear back into the forest forever. The night was almost completely silent as Hughes approached the storage building. The wind moved gently through the pine trees while darkness covered the surrounding woods. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared carrying a backpack filled with food and basic supplies. The man was thin, heavily bearded, and dressed in worn clothing that reflected years of life outdoors. He moved carefully but without panic, unaware that his long-hidden existence had finally come to an end. Hughes stepped forward, identified himself, and ordered the stranger to stop. Christopher Knight froze. There was no dramatic chase through the forest. There was no desperate attempt to escape into the darkness. After spending 27 years avoiding every search party, every patrol, and every investigation, Christopher simply stood where he was. The invisible man who had become a legend across central Maine had finally been found. During the arrest, Hughes later recalled feeling almost surreal. For years, he had pursued someone many people believed could never be caught. Now that person stood only a few feet away. Christopher remained calm and cooperative. He offered no resistance and answered basic questions politely. The confrontation ended almost as quietly as it had begun. One of the greatest mysteries in modern American criminal history had concluded not with violence, but with silence. Investigators searched Christopher's backpack and found exactly what years of burglary reports had suggested. Inside were food, candy, batteries, and other simple necessities. There were no expensive valuables, stolen cash, or luxury items. Everything reflected a man who had devoted nearly 3 decades to surviving alone in the wilderness. Soon afterward, officers located his hidden campsite deep within the forest. Many expected to find something resembling a primitive survival shelter, but what they discovered instead demonstrated remarkable organization and discipline. Tarps had been carefully arranged beneath thick evergreen branches to conceal the camp from anyone passing nearby. Supplies were stacked neatly and protected from moisture. Books, clothing, propane cylinders, cooking equipment, and hundreds of practical items filled the tiny campsite. Everything had its place. It was the home of someone who had learned that order was essential to survival. Perhaps the greatest surprise was the camp's location. It was not hidden on a remote mountain or deep within an inaccessible wilderness. It lay remarkably close to the cabins Christopher had entered for years. Search teams had unknowingly passed within walking distance of it on several occasions without recognizing what lay hidden beneath the trees. His ability to remain unseen had never depended upon distance alone. It depended upon extraordinary patience, discipline, and an almost unmatched understanding of concealment. As news of the arrest spread across Maine and eventually throughout the United States, reporters rushed to North Pond. The legend of the North Pond Hermit was no longer just a story shared among local residents. The mysterious figure finally had a face, and people everywhere wanted to understand how one ordinary man had vanished from society for nearly 3 decades without anyone knowing where he was. Following his arrest, Christopher Knight was taken into custody for questioning. For investigators, this was the moment they had anticipated for years. They finally had the opportunity to ask the question that had puzzled everyone since his disappearance in 1986. Why would someone willingly abandon modern society and spend 27 years living completely alone in the wilderness? Many expected a dramatic explanation involving crime, trauma, or some carefully planned escape. Instead, Christopher offered an answer that was remarkably simple and, in many ways, even more unsettling. He explained that there had been no single event that drove him into the forest. He had not been running from the law, hiding from dangerous people, or attempting to build a new identity. He simply wanted to be alone. That explanation left psychologists and investigators searching for deeper meaning. Throughout history, there have been individuals who chose lives of solitude, but Christopher Knight's isolation was unlike almost anything documented in modern times. For nearly 27 years, he had spoken to almost no one. Later interviews revealed that during those decades, he believed he had exchanged only a few words with another person, little more than a brief greeting to a passing hiker. The rest of his existence unfolded in almost complete silence. Experts noted that prolonged isolation often leads to severe psychological distress, hallucinations, anxiety, and emotional instability. Yet Christopher appeared calm, thoughtful, and mentally organized. Although he acknowledged feelings of loneliness at times, he also described experiencing a profound sense of peace while living entirely outside society. Even today, psychologists continue to debate how he managed to endure such extraordinary solitude. Investigators eventually documented the remarkable scale of Christopher's survival. During nearly 3 decades in the woods, he admitted to committing more than 1,000 burglaries. The overwhelming majority involved taking only the supplies necessary to remain alive. Food accounted for most of what he stole, followed by batteries, flashlights, propane cylinders, clothing, books, magazines, and camping equipment. He rarely damaged property and almost never entered occupied cabins. His goal was always the same: obtain what he needed while remaining completely invisible. Although his crimes caused understandable frustration and financial loss for cabin owners, investigators found no evidence that he had ever attempted to physically harm anyone. When Christopher eventually appeared in court, he pleaded guilty to numerous burglary charges. The legal proceedings attracted national media attention because of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding his case. Considering that he had never committed violent offenses and had cooperated fully after his arrest, the court imposed a relatively short period of incarceration along with restitution to many of the property owners whose cabins he had entered. For the legal system, the case had reached its conclusion. For the people living around North Pond, however, the emotional impact would last much longer. Many cabin owners described experiencing mixed emotions after learning the identity of the mysterious burglar. Some felt relieved that decades of uncertainty had finally ended. Others admitted that they found it difficult to hate Christopher despite the repeated thefts. He had violated their homes and taken their belongings, yet he had never threatened them or destroyed their property. Several residents later reflected on something they found deeply unsettling. For years, they had celebrated birthdays, gathered around campfires, watched their children play near the lake, and enjoyed peaceful vacations without realizing that another human being lived quietly in the surrounding forest. Christopher later acknowledged that he occasionally observed people from a distance, not out of hostility, but simply because they were part of the only world he still knew. That realization caused many people to look differently at the woods surrounding their cabins. Places that had once seemed peaceful now carried memories of an invisible neighbor who had always been there, silently watching from the trees. After serving his sentence, Christopher Knight once again disappeared from public attention. This time, however, he did not vanish into the wilderness. Instead, he chose a private life away from media attention, declining interviews and avoiding the publicity that followed his arrest. In many respects, his personality remained unchanged. He had never sought fame, and he showed little interest in explaining himself beyond the few conversations he granted after his capture. The mystery surrounding his inner thoughts remains largely unresolved. Today, the story of Christopher Knight continues to fascinate psychologists, criminologists, survival experts, and ordinary readers around the world. Some view him as one of the most accomplished survivalists in modern American history. Others see him as a deeply troubled man who withdrew completely from society. Still others regard his life as a remarkable study of human solitude and the limits of psychological endurance. Whatever interpretation people choose, one fact remains undeniable. For 27 years, an ordinary man succeeded in doing something almost no one believed possible. He disappeared into the forests of Maine, lived within walking distance of dozens of homes, entered more than 1,000 cabins, and remained hidden from one of the largest and longest searches ever conducted in the region. There are no ghosts in this story. There are no supernatural creatures lurking among the pine trees. There are no ancient curses or haunted cabins. The true source of fear lies in something far more realistic. For nearly 3 decades, an unseen man moved silently through a quiet community without being noticed. Families unknowingly shared the landscape with someone they never met, someone who watched the changing seasons from the shadows while the rest of the world carried on with ordinary life. Christopher Knight was not a myth. He was not a legend created by frightened imaginations. He was a real person whose extraordinary choice to abandon society became one of the most remarkable true stories of isolation ever recorded. And perhaps that is what makes his story so unforgettable. Sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are not born from the supernatural. They are born from the extraordinary things that real human beings are capable of doing.